Well, hello everyone. I am so sorry to stop the music midway. I know it's a good one, but we welcome you all to today's office hours. I am Jen Splansky Jester, Executive Director of the Collective Impact Forum. And on behalf of the forum and our host partners, FSG and the Aspen Institute Forum for Community Solutions, it's our pleasure to welcome you to today's office hours, Navigating the Backbone Role. And before we go any further, we want to be sure to begin our time together acknowledging the Indigenous lands that we are all joining from. Although we're meeting virtually, we believe it's important to acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from Indigenous territory, and we honor and respect the diverse Indigenous peoples connected to this land and honor their past, present, and future on these lands. We would like to acknowledge that this session is presented and recorded on the traditional land of the Muskogee, Potawatomi, Menominee, Ojibwe, Ohlone, Coast Salish, Muckleshoot, Still-Quamish, Suquamish, and Duwamish people, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people of these tribes. We'd now like to give a moment for you all to join us in the land acknowledgement. And if you know the lands that you're joining from, we invite you to share those in the chat. And if you're not sure whose land you are on, we have two resources here for you to look that up, from Native Lands and from Code for Anchorage. And thank you to those organizations for the service. So please do let us know where you're joining from. I see another person joining from the Coast Salish area. Wonderful. And as those come in, please do keep them coming. We invite folks, if this is new information for you, to make a note of this. And it's a great first step to understand more about the communities that are part of your area, both historically and currently. And we also want to recognize that acknowledging Indigenous lands and communities is just the first step to strengthening knowledge, relationships, and accountability to better support our Indigenous community members. So as you build your own deep knowledge of the many layers within your community or the communities where you work, we want to uplift the importance of getting to know the Indigenous communities in your region as part of that work. We also want to mention that the Native Governance Center has many great resources from going beyond the land acknowledgement, and encourage you to check out their work and their resources at nativegov.org. So thank you to everyone who participated in the chat in our land acknowledgement. So today kicks off a busy spring for the Collective Impact Forum team. So thank you for joining today's office hours. In 2 weeks, we want to make sure folks know we have another one of these open office hours for you to bring your questions. The next one is on the use of data in collective impact, and we'll be joined by our colleagues Nanette from the Aspen Institute Forum for Community Solutions and Junius, Senior Advisor to the Collective Impact Forum, and our colleague Courtney, who you'll meet today, will be moderating to go deep on questions related to the use of data in collective impact. And then in case you don't already have it on your calendar, our virtual Collective Impact Action Summit will be happening later this spring, and we invite you to join, and that is our biggest and most exciting learning event of the year. So we hope you will join us April 30th through May 2nd. All right, so most of you have likely figured this out already, but we have a couple tech tips here. You'll notice that we are in the webinar platform, which means that we welcome folks to engage in the Q&A box, in the chat box. But we also have a Q&A box where we will ask you to share the questions that you're bringing to today's office hours. So please feel free to keep using chat to connect with each other and use Q&A to share your questions. We also will be sharing a recording of today's session and a copy of the PDF for anyone that registered for today. And as always, thank you to our colleague Tracy Timmons-Gray for supporting the event leading up to and today. And Tracy is also available for any questions that you have regarding technology for today's session. All right. So without further ado, I am delighted to welcome my colleagues, Courtney Robertson and Paul Schmitz, into the conversation. You can see their pictures are already up on the screen. And Courtney, Paul, and I will be fielding your questions on the backbone role today. Paul, Paul and Courtney, if you join our events often, are no strangers, but in case you are new to our space, Paul is a senior advisor to the Collective Impact Forum and CEO and founder of the organization Leading Inside Out. Also joining me is my colleague Courtney Robertson, Director of Programs and Partnerships at the Collective Impact Forum. You can certainly read more about both of them online, and I'm excited to welcome their expertise into the room today. So as grounding for today's session, we thought it might be helpful just to share a couple background and I guess level setting slides about the backbone role. Several of you shared questions for our team when you registered, and we have a couple of those that we're going to start with. But it reminded us that there might be some content that would be helpful to start with to address some of the questions that we saw head on, to kind of preempt them and address them head on. So as a reminder, this is probably familiar to folks, but when we talk about collective impact work, this place-based, equity-centered, collaborative work, research tells us that there are 5 conditions or 5 elements that often are present that contribute, that help these collaboratives, your collaboratives contribute to impact at scale in your communities. And we have the common agenda, shared measurement, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, and of course, backbone is the 5th and one of the most grounding principles and elements of the collective impact effort itself. And so when our team, learning from many folks in the field and studying collective impact efforts, when we look at the kind of roles backbone entities play, what we see backbone teams doing often spread across these 6 different roles. And I will preface this with, these probably aren't comprehensive of everything a backbone does, nor are they all always held as expertise and skills in the same individual person. But these are 6 different things and roles, I guess you could say, that backbones often fulfill on behalf of the collaborative. So the first is guiding the vision and strategy. So in the early days, this is helping often shepherd the process of identifying the result that the collective will focus on and creating that common agenda that we often talk about. And the backbone is the guide or the facilitator of that process. And then, of course, the backbone is also going to facilitate the process of identifying what the strategies, or sometimes we'll call them the aligned activities, are, and then providing sometimes for the group facilitation support, helping create and craft work plans. So the backbone is not doing the activities, but rather supporting the group to move their activities forward. Third, we talked about shared measurement as a core element of collective impact. Well, often it is, and it's important for the backbone to really keep data front and center in the work. And so here we refer to that as helping to establish shared measurement practices. So you can think of this as bringing data that the collective has identified as is important into the meetings, into the spaces where the collective is coming together, so that the group can be learning from that data and adjusting their activities accordingly and holding each other accountable for progress and looking at the data in order to inform the work. The 4th is advancing policy. So policy work can be an important lever that collective impact efforts take on. And one of the things that we sometimes see backbones do, more common, like when the collective is really up and running, is supporting identification of policy opportunities for the collective and helping bring those to the group overall. Often the backbone has that bird's eye view of what's happening across the community, across the system, to identify these kinds of opportunities and bring them to the backbone. bring them as the backbone to the collective. Fifth, we have mobilizing resources. So this, yes, the backbone will need some resources to support its own work in the collaborative infrastructure, if you will. But with that bird's eye view that the backbone often brings, the backbone can also identify opportunities to bring resources for the work of the collective of the partners to fund some of the aligned activities that the collective identifies. So the backbone doesn't become the fundraising entity for the partner organizations, definitely not. But the backbone often can have the kind of that big picture view to identify resource opportunities and sometimes support collaborative grant applications or processes to bring resources in for the collective as a whole. And then the last one, sort of cutting across everything, is cultivating community engagement and ownership. So this is a role for the backbone of ensuring that community voice and community representation is part of the collective, that residents, friends, families, neighbors, individuals with lived experience are part of the collective, and creating spaces where power is shared and all folks at the table, from formal leaders in formal positions of community leadership and community leaders that are coming together, are all working together to contribute to the work of the collective. So I remind us that these don't often live all within the same individual, but that the backbone as a whole, often staffed in part or whole by multiple different folks, hopefully are holding these different capacities, skills, and expertise. The other thing I want to speak to is that sometimes we hear some misperceptions or some common missteps that we can see the backbone teams taking or being asked to take by members of the collective. So we want to be clear that it's not the backbone setting the agenda for the group. The backbone is actually facilitating the process and creating the space for the group to set the agenda. And similarly, the backbone isn't determining and then implementing all the solutions. The collective is not an advisory body to only the backbone. The collective is the one that is driving the solutions. We also want to clarify, as I was alluding to, it's not the backbone doing all the work. It is the backbone supporting the work of the group. And sometimes we hear folks under the impression that the backbone will receive all the funding or a lot of the funding for a topic in the community that's on the topic of the collective. And then in some cases, re-grant that out to the community. That's not really the intention of the backbone. The backbone is the support for the collective, not the bottleneck or the channel for funding on that topic going into the community. And then finally, this is a little bit, has some nuance to it, but it's tricky when the backbone is self-appointed. So a backbone raising their hand and saying, follow me, I'm going to be the backbone. That's not often the best way to garner sort of support and trust from the partners you're convening. Rather, it's very helpful to have partners collaboratively identify and endorse the individual or the organization that is playing that backbone role as a broker of the process. So these are some of those misperceptions or common misunderstandings that we hear related to the backbone. So we wanted to name those right up front. Okay, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to take down the screen share and officially welcome Courtney and Paul. Thank you for joining us, Paul and Courtney. And folks on the line shared some really good questions in their registration. And so we thought that we would start with a few of those and use those to dive into the Q&A part of our office hours. So I'm going to dive right in with one question that came in. And someone asks, do you have any suggestions for people moving into a backbone organization or a backbone role from a place of doing the work? So Paul, Courtney, where would you like to start?
Well, I can I'll jump in, and then Paul, of course, would love to hear your thoughts on this. But one, really glad to be in this space today and to share and hopefully add value to the work that you all are doing. So I actually spent in my previous role and organization, I spent 3 years as a partner before joining that backbone team, and then worked on that backbone team for 7 years. And my role coming into the work was a facilitator. So we were a cradle to career partnership, focusing on everything from literally early childhood, or not early childhood, like early visitation to college degree attainment, opportunity youth, et cetera. And so I had another colleague and I who co-facilitated all of those work groups. There were about 6 or 7 work groups that we were co-facilitating along with partnership meetings, and then also doing some training. And one of the shifts that I had to make was to be really intentional about taking my mindset out of that of being a partner to that of being a backbone team member. And they may sound very like duh, but I remember in my very first meeting, I was, of course, co-facilitating, but I found myself in a lot of instances joining the partner side of the conversation, offering suggestions, offering solutions, et cetera. And so it took a while for me to like get to the point where I wasn't doing that. But I had my colleague call me out. She was not calling me out in front of the group, but she was basically like, hey, we can't do that. Like we're holding neutral, we're supporting the group's work, right? And that was something I'd experienced, but you don't think about as a partner. You're just engaged in the conversation. So just being really intentional about how you're showing up. And with that, being very clear about what the backbone role is. I think some people, again, you engage as a partner, and so you understand like what supports are happening, but you may not fully understand the role of a backbone, right, in its purest sense. So taking that time on the front end, if you're joining a backbone team from doing the work, to really understand like what is our function, what is our role, and then what is my specific role in helping us realize that, and being very, very, very clear about that. And that was something I thought I was clear on because I read the article, right? I knew what, the collective impact approach was, but I've never had to be intentional about thinking about those things. A couple of the things I'll lift up is just like this shift to focusing on systems. A lot of times as a partner, right, you're coming in with your organizational lens, right, around the work, but in a backbone role, you're really having to think about the system and the set of partners, right, and not just one individual partner and what they're contributing. So really doing the work to understand like what does it mean to hold a systems lens? How does that show up in how I facilitate? How does that show up in how I ask questions to the partnership, et cetera? So being very clear about those things. And I think the one of the biggest things to take away is like remembering your experience as a partner. So one of the things that I knew was, I at least thought, I won't say knew, was needed coming into the backbone. I was like, we never had like a formal orientation, right? Like I just kind of stepped into the work as a partner and as an individual. So that was one of the first things I proposed coming into my new role, was like we should actually offer some type of formal orientation for partners, right? So that we can, break down what does it mean to be a part of this partnership, help them understand like their role in it, et cetera. And those are things that happen, but it could have happened more formally. So just like thinking about your own experience being a partner within the partnership, and how they can either be, how you can either underscore the things that worked really well, or try to, troubleshoot or problem solve for the things that you think can be improved. So holding that lens, and also holding that lens as you all are thinking about decisions, how you're holding meeting spaces, et cetera, always remembering what was it like for me as a partner being a part of this partnership, I think is critically important, and not to lose that perspective. But I also just told you to sort of shift your perspective as well, right? Around what does it mean to be in a backbone. So sort of holding those, the duality of those two things, right? I think are critically important.
I would just add, and I agree with everything Courtney said. In my experience with this work, the biggest challenge is that this requires a mindset shift, and all of our mental models and ways of working and experience we've typically had is within the context of an organization, and we have to shift to thinking like a network. And to me, the moment you start thinking like an organization as the backbone, you're in trouble. Like you've got to constantly be thinking about it as a network. And what that means is that your role is not to decide what the work is or to do the work. Your job is to hold the common agenda everyone's agreed to and to help activate other people to move the things that move that agenda, not to do the things yourself, not to make decisions about what new things you're going to do, not to take on new projects and programs. And the problem is, because this work is really hard and a little bit messy, we often default to what we know, and it's much easier to create a project or program than to like activate other people and manage them outside our organization to move results together. And so we have to be very careful to hold that. And the other thing is that it's entirely relational. If you are not spending one-on-one time with your partners, going to coffee, going to meals, visiting them at their offices to learn about what they do, their interests, motivations, you can't anticipate them. You can't understand them. You probably don't have enough trust. You have to build individual relationships with your partners, get to know people, have them get to know you. And you've got to be able to constantly test yourself on, are we starting to act more like an organization, or are we continuing to act like a network? Your job as a backbone is to facilitate people's work, coordinate people working together, and project manage them to do the work everyone's agreed to. And when we focus on, and as I said, getting people to do things is hard. And it means you've got to manage their change. They've got to change their expectations and how they work. And they might not always see that. So you've got to be having the relationships and working with them around it. But that to me is the biggest thing, is that it's a shift. And all of our ways of working are based on being in organizations. And we have to think and operate like we're a network and not default to the practices we've always used when it gets hard.
Awesome, Paul, Courtney, thank you. I'm going to keep us moving because I already see more questions coming in. So how would you define and maintain clear boundaries for the backbone role? I mean, I will start, I just shared at least one way to frame the role of the backbone. The Collective Impact Forum website has resources that have sample backbone job descriptions, and we have resources on the backbone. But I think, you're even in asking this question, you're recognizing role clarity is so important, and having, documented what their backbone role is, and being sure that all of the partners in the collective are familiar with that. And then as a companion to that, I would also document what the roles of the partners are. And different collaboratives are structured differently, but we often see an advisory group or a steering committee, they need a clear role description as well. Working groups or action teams, they need a clear description as well. And so I think being very clear what your role is, and hopefully the slides we already shared spoke a bit to what that role in many cases can look like. And then having, maybe it's the orientation resource Courtney shared, but anyone new that joins, make sure that they understand the backbone role and their own role as they're joining. Paul or Courtney, do you want to add to that or keep moving?
I would just quickly add that I would suggest creating a chart for your collective impact that has the key tasks of the work and has a column for backbone role, partners and action teams, and steering committee, and be clear what the authority of each group and action of each group is for every task. Steering committee makes decisions on governance issues, or like they approve the common agenda, the action team and partners create the common agenda, the backbone facilitates it, but for every task kind of lay out those three roles. And again, I think the other thing about boundary is just really holding yourself to looking in the mirror and seeking feedback regularly to make sure you're not getting trapped into being the one doing the work, but you're doing the hard work of facilitating others.
All right,
The only other thing I would add to that, how we packaged all of that was in a partnership agreement, right? So it literally spelled out, this is our approach to the partnership. Here are definitions and terminologies we use. Here are the expectations for the backbone, for the partners, et cetera. And we walk folks through that during that orientation, right? And it would be a mix of the ED, individuals who might be a part of those work groups, et cetera, so that everybody was getting the same information. And I know that's very time consuming, but that's the best way to make sure that there's clarity around what folks' expectations are engaging in the partnership.
Awesome, thank you. Okay. Do we all have advice on navigating expectations around funding to and from the Backbone org? And how do we navigate applying to the same funders?
I think the first part of it is when the Backbone is raising money on its own without coordination by the steering committee and the partners, that's what makes it tricky. I think the important thing is that there's clarity that says we all agree that this goal that we're reaching towards, third grade reading, healthy birth outcomes, whatever that result is that we've organized our collective around, is important. And to do this, we need a backbone role. And we've all agreed that the backbone role needs this level of capacity, which means we need to raise X amount of dollars a year. And that we share that plan. Here's the funders we're going to go to fund the backbone, and we need your help and support to do it. It needs to be transparent. It needs to be clear, and it needs to be something agreed upon. If you're raising money for the collective, for your backbone role in the collective, and the people in the collective don't agree you should be raising money for that, you've got a problem. You've got a big problem. It should be something that you're authorized to do because the steering committee has approved a budget based on what the partners say they will need to do the work that we've all agreed to. But if people have agreed to an agenda, you've agreed on a structure, you've agreed this is the backbone staff we need, we've built a budget for it, the steering committee's approved it, then it shouldn't be a conflict because everyone should know what you're doing, why you're doing it, and why it's important. And it may be competitive at times. And again, that's a conversation you have to have with those partners and with those funders about it, and make clear that to those funders that we need to be able to do the work, and we need to be able to facilitate the larger change we're trying to create around that work. But if you starve doing the work to supporting the work, it's not going to work. If you're going to fund us, don't deny also funding the work, but you've got to be transparent and open and clear with everybody on it. Courtney, did you guys run into that?
And it's interesting because the way that our organization came about was actually through a school merger conversation, believe it or not. So high level, there were two school districts, the city district, the county district. Essentially, the city district surrendered its charter to the county. For 1 year, it was one school district, and then it turned into 7. For that year that it was one, there was what was called a transition committee, who were basically identifying what is this transition going to look like, what is this merger going to look like, and what are the supports we're going to need. And through that work, which included community, they basically identified that we need a third-party organization to help coordinate outside supports and services with the school. And so that's how our organization was birthed. So we actually started through a United Way and then became our own formal 501c3. So with that, we did, of course, raise money for our functionality, but for joint programs or any projects or things that were happening within the collective, that was a joint effort with key partners from the collective, right, to bring those dollars to that work. So it's a little bit different in terms of how we were started and appointed.
Yeah. We often say if you've seen one collective impact effort, you've seen one collective impact effort, right? So trying to lift up trends, but recognize the context is very, very different for sure. So I'm going to ask a question here from Bindu. What makes an organization particularly well suited to specifically a backbone role in a coalition, if anything? And I might actually parse that out a little bit to what makes an organization well suited, and then what makes an individual, leader and team well suited to play that role. Because I think they're not all, I think we could answer both of those questions and hopefully address several people's curiosities. When it comes to the organization, I think I'll say we see different tax statuses often play in the background. We've seen nonprofits, we've seen public agencies, we've seen individual sort of facilitator, independent consultants. Sometimes we even see United Ways, community foundations. What's most important in our experience, or my experience, for an organization is that you are able to be a neutral or an honest broker of the process. So it has to be an organization that is able to empower the staff playing the backbone role to serve the coalition, and not be really and not represent exclusively represent the work of the host organization itself. So one way to do that is you could have the backbone staff actually reporting to the chairs of the steering committee instead of or in addition to an internal report in the organization. So that's like a structural way to think about it. So you want an organization that can empower its backbone team to be accountable to the coalition, not only to the organization in which it sits. I think it's helpful also if the organization is able to have the resources to support the backbone role for ideally, we would say at least 1 to 2 years up front, because we know these processes and the relational work really takes time to build. And so being able to resource the backbone is organizationally an important component. And so those are some things that come to mind for me for the organization. I will ask Paul and Courtney about that, and then let's come back to the individual leader.
I think that's right. I mean, I would just add that for the organization side, just being really transparent and clear how any interest differences or conflicts of interest would be dealt with and what authority that they have. So can the board of the organization override a steering committee decision? Can the CEO of the organization override a steering committee decision? Do they have extra power within the steering committee? Are there areas where there might be conflict between what the collective's doing in the organization and how will that be managed? So I think that being really upfront and clear in trying to identify kind of what those interest differences might be and to think through those authority issues and define those clearly is really important for the organization. And exactly that's what helps make it an honest broker. It doesn't mean that there might not be certain powers the organization has to retain legally and otherwise. It's just making that really clear and spelling it out. And again, part of building trust is transparency. And so it's just got to be transparent and clear how are you doing it.
Thanks, Paul. So let me ask the second part about what makes individuals particularly well suited to play the backbone role. And Paul, I think you're actually working on a paper right now speaking to some of the skills that you see in successful backbone leaders. So I'm going to toss that to you.
There are, I mean, the first is it's relational, as I said before, that if you think you can do this work just on Zoom or just checking in with people occasionally on the phone, that's not going to work. You've got to be out there meeting with people, getting to know people, visible with people, connecting and then connecting with you, that the relational part is important. With that, there's 5 qualities we've kind of identified that are really important. One is that you have to be able to hold a result. You've got to keep everyone's eye on the prize and keep people focused on the strategy, the common agenda, and where you're at. And you should always know where you're at in terms of the common agenda and what's behind and where we're ahead and be able to like keep people focused on it. The second is political savvy. You've got to know how systems work and you've got to know how to influence them. You might not have all the knowledge yourself, but you might have to have people in your coalition who are helping you do that. But you've got to be able to understand the small p and big P politics around the work you're doing and how to lever those. The third is project management, that to coordinate a network to do work, if you don't have a tool that lays out what the work is that everyone's agreed to and when it needs to be done and who's doing it, and you're not managing that, it's going to fall back into just people doing what they're already doing as activities, and it's not going to move the agenda. You've got to have tools and a process for project managing the network to do the work. You have to be an inclusive facilitator, that you have to create an environment in which people can really work together effectively, and that builds trust, that people, again, feel that sense of honest brokering. And so those are some of the things we've really emphasized as kind of key qualities. There's others too, but those are some of the main ones that we think that it's really helpful to have. And those all don't have to be held by one person. That's why it's often a backbone team. But if team members play different parts of that skill set, they need to be empowered to play that role within it. But those are some of the skills. I'm sorry, the fifth one would be is centering equity, which we've talked a lot about and written a paper about and done a toolkit on and other things, but like keeping that central, not just in terms of the outcomes, but in terms of participation, in terms of the governance, in terms of thinking at every level of the collective.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Okay, Courtney, Paul, do we have advice on navigating playing a backbone role within a broader organization that is aligned, but at the same time has other priorities outside of the priorities of the collective impact work?
Deep, I have questions. I do too. Like contextual question for that one. My first thought is having staff, of course, who are dedicated to the collective impact work, right? Because I think when you have folks who are, you have this work, but you also have these other priorities, it could get really tricky. Something's gonna have to be deprioritized, right? So I think as much as possible, having dedicated staff who solely focus on the work of the collective, and then having separate staff who are focused on those other priorities. Because we do, even in a couple of our sites that we're coaching, right? Like for example, one site that we're supporting, they're actually housed within city government, right? And we know that there's tons of other work, right, that's happening outside of that collective impact work. And I think they're having some of those very similar challenges. Like we have this thing going, right, but we also have the other work that has to happen. So it's not abnormal, right, or it's not a rarity to have that, but just being really clear. And I think thinking about how you're leveraging your capacity internally to like be really focused across those different lanes of work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that again, like the question is, where is that? How are those other priorities impeding the work of the collective, or may they impede or create conflicts between the other work of the organization and this, and just naming those explicitly and working through them. Because, you know, I've certainly seen collective impacts that are sitting within a United Way that has other priorities and other areas they're doing, but it hasn't affected the work of that collective. It hasn't impeded them. But I've seen others where it does. And so I think the question again is more about like, where are the impediments that's causing, or potential impediments, and where are the conflicts that might pose of interest or priority, and how do you reconcile that?
Great, thank you both. So we've referred a few times to a backbone team, and someone says, say more about what you mean by backbone team. Are the individuals usually at the same organization? So I'll share that in my experience, we've seen both. We've seen teams that sit within a single organization. We've also seen backbone teams that are comprised of individuals that sit in multiple organizations. So pros and cons to both. Typically what we would see in a team is ideally a collective has at least one FTE who is waking up every day thinking about the collective and doing all the work we've been talking about. Resources permitting, it can be, you know, a 2 or 3 person team. And again, all contextual, but if you have a 2 or 3 person team, that can be really helpful. And we would see something like, you know, a backbone director, executive director, who's, you know, kind of the lead facilitator, doing a lot of the outreach to folks in the community. Then you might have somebody who brings a lot of data expertise to be doing a lot of the data work. To contribute to all of the shared measurement work we mentioned for the collective. And then you might have someone who's more of like a project manager or administrative type role to support the work, because as you know, we've already mentioned, and you know, there's a lot of project management work that goes into playing the backbone role. So we've seen smaller teams, we've seen much bigger teams, but I would say those 3 functions, if you can staff them either within an org or across a few different individuals sitting in different places, can be helpful. Most commonly, if there's a skill set that sits in a different org, I often see that being the data role. So you might have Paul mentioned local United Way or local nonprofit playing the facilitator and the director role. And then perhaps there's a local data intermediary or a local university that really provides a lot of capacity on the data component. So that's just an example of how you might split that across organizations. And of course, good coordination and communication if you're sitting in different orgs or even within the same org is really important. I think I'll go to the next question. Okay. How do you deal with the challenge of the backbone team being the staff that also holds the funding as well, such as a municipality? Anyone want
Again,
to jump in?
funding in what sense? Like, are you holding, so if it's an entity that also makes funding decisions, what's your role in making those funding decisions? How transparent are those processes? How clear are those like it's again, we've seen people do this in ways that are really effective because they've been transparent, they've been clear, they've said, here's how decisions get made at the city for funding from the health department. We have influence on that, and certainly I bring the agenda to those meetings, but I don't make those decisions. Just making clear what the lines of authority and accountability are. And if the backbone is the person themselves making funding decisions, to what role are they making those funding decisions to align and move forward the agenda everyone's agreed to? If everyone's agreed, this is the agenda, these are the strategies, and these are the groups that have to implement these parts of the strategy, are you funding based on that strategy, or are you just funding randomly? Like, it's about that clarity and transparency.
And to just sort of underscore what Paul said, probably not as explicitly, is like that steering committee, right, can become your checks and balances, right? As you're making those funding decisions, right? Again, to Paul's point, they should be driven by the agenda that the collaborative has set, but also having this feedback loop and sort of this shared accountability with that committee and with your larger partnership around where dollars are going. And just being very transparent, quite frankly. I think a lot of times folks just want to know where money is going and how it's being used. And if you withhold that information or seem reticent to offer that type of information, it raises flags for folks. So as much as possible, being transparent about where those dollars are going, having regular opportunities to discuss how money is being spent, what the financial situation is looking like, is also a way just to get ahead of any skepticism that could exist.
Yeah. And there's another question in the Q&A box around along these lines of some best practices for backbones that are structured to receive all the funding and re-grant it. That's sort of the structure that can't shift. What advice we have. So Courtney was just mentioning sort of transparency when possible, trying to create, if there are ways to create structures for decisions to be made by, it could be a grant making committee that is, with real intention made to be a representative group of the coalition, or having the whole steering committee making those decisions, and being as clear as possible about the criteria by which decisions are being made, and having that criteria ideally co-created by the partners and a representative group of partners. So those are some practices and structures that you could put in place to make the funding decisions more of a shared responsibility, even if it is technically structured to fall to the role of the backbone.
Yeah, and what I would add, if there's opportunity to bring in a third party, right, to be a pass-through, if you will, for funds. One of the things we did, we'd actually piloted sort of like an accelerator, if you will, where we had 5 or 6 organizations go through a year-long improvement project with us. And we had those dollars actually, because they were also receiving funds, all of those funds were actually passed through our community foundation. So they were a partner in that. They handled all of the financial pieces, right? So that we could truly be seen as a neutral party in that work, right? So we did not touch the funds at all, right? Like any distributions of funds, et cetera, but we did handle all of the reporting, right? And aggregating those reports for the foundation itself, but partner with them to actually be the pass-through for those dollars. So if there are opportunities to do that, I would suggest that path versus, particularly if you weren't structured to do that as a backbone, it could just get really dicey and be really, really challenging. It just adds another layer to the work that you're already doing.
Okay. Thank you, Courtney. Next question. A more tactical one. How often do you recommend that the collectives meet?
Regularly. And scheduled, not like ad hoc.
Yes.
Don't schedule a meeting and then say, when should we meet next? One rhythm I've liked when groups have done it is having all their action teams or work groups meet on odd months, and then having the steering committee meet on even months, so that they have 1 month when all the action teams meet and do their work, and then that all comes to the steering committee, and the steering committee can give feedback and or offer support. And then the following month, and so every month you either have like it's an action team month or a steering committee month. And that rhythm I found works well in terms of just like keeping a routine and keeping the flow of information governance and work between the two. Now, some groups have steering committees that meet quarterly, or some have action teams that meet monthly. And I can say from a collective, like I was part of a collective where the action teams met every other month. But when we had a really important issue, we might be meeting every month or every 2 weeks for just a period because we're doing a big event or we got a big advocacy day coming up. And so that can change. But the idea is the regularly scheduled was every other month it's on. And sometimes we'd add additional meetings when there were urgent things we were working on together. But I think the main thing is just have a calendar and keep to it and keep it clean so that you can kind of keep the work flowing between everybody. Because the goal is to make sure that there's always a communication flow.
All right. Thank you, Paul. Okay, so how can we deal with lessening momentum or fatigue over the long term?
Don't try to do everything at once. I know it's very tempting to try to have 50 strategies going at once, but really being intentional about how the work is happening. I think also celebrating the small wins, right? Like the smallest of things, so that people and identifying what those small wins are and pursuing those, right? Because I think once folks see that we can do something together, people are willing to then engage in the work that takes longer, right? But it can be frustrating to like join a collaborative and then you don't see anything for 2.5 years, right? But if you can see some immediate wins, right? Even if it's we landed on our strategy and we got some funding to implement it, right? Like you celebrate that because that's a milestone in the work. So just having those opportunities built in to really, really do celebrate the work and be reflective about the work. And to that point, I think also having regular opportunities to re-examine your work and to like look at what you're doing, not just doing the work and trudging through, right? But really taking a step back and saying, like, does this still make sense for where we are in the work? Who else do we need to be inviting in? Because that keeps the conversations fresh. And it also keeps you all thinking about what's going to be new about this, right? In a continuous way, right? So those are things that I would offer.
I couldn't agree more. And the celebration is huge. The one thing I'll say, which is a little bit heavy, is just that I think that there's fatigue and lack of momentum when there's not clear strategies that add up to move the goals. Is that when people can see the collective impacts, I know that they're seeing the goals that they have move, their overall population level results moving, or the system is changing, they have high attendance at their meetings because people are able to see how their participation and contributions move a result. The ones that are more about sharing about activities we're doing back at our agencies and light coordination of what we're doing, and our strategies don't really add up. We can't see grade level reading moving from all the meetings we're having. We can't see birth outcomes improving. When that's the case, then it's more fatigue, more mischief. There's more interest coming to bear. There's more jockeying, there's lots of it's a recipe for lots of different problems, but the fatigue and motivation happen when it's not clear what everyone's doing and why their contributions are necessary to move our overall goal, and that we can see how our contributions matter, and that keeps people motivated at the table and doing their work. When they can't see the progress, that burns people out. It's just lots of meetings and process then.
And
Great points.
I will just say quickly, speaking of meetings, I think Paul would agree. If you're having boring meetings, then people don't want to show up to boring meetings. So making sure that there's engagement, right? There's activity, that people are having opportunities to be reflective, to share progress in their work, to identify opportunities to, to make their work better, right? Like rethinking how we have meetings is critically important, and making sure that they're not sit and gets, and that you're consistent and people know what to expect, right, when they show up to those meeting spaces, and that they're excited to show up to those meeting spaces as well. Meetings don't have to be boring. I'll say that probably every webinar we have.
Thanks, Courtney. So speaking of good facilitation, how would the backbone work to reconcile opposing views within the collective?
Well, first you have to allow space for people to have opposing views, and it be okay. No, seriously, and it'd be okay to have opposing views. We actually we just recorded a podcast maybe about a month ago with the organization who's about a year into their policy work. And one of the things they said they do intentionally is that they want to make sure they have people in those policy conversations who actually hold views that are opposite of what the larger collective holds, right? Because they said it makes it a much more robust conversation and a more holistic conversation. So I think having the space for people to be able to like air out their grievances and be able to name what it is that they're opposing, right? And why they're opposing those things, and not just shutting down conversation because it doesn't align to either what the group thinks or like what you think should be happening in that space. So just making space for people to have that type of discourse and making it a norm and not something that's contentious.
I agree, and we talk a lot about adaptive work. People work is adaptive work. This is where it gets hard. This is where the rubber meets the road. And just a couple thought, which is there are a lot of different tools to use for that process. But one thing you can always do is ask people, it's great to voice opposition. The question is, what would have to be true for you to commit to this? What conditions would have to be true in order for you to commit to this action or thing? And get people away from just what they don't like toward what they actually need, and test those out. And really get to know what people's observations and interpretations are that have led them to their, someone says, I'm opposed to this for this. Say, well, tell us what you're seeing that's led you there. Like, how do you get there? What are you seeing that's led you to think that way? And then what conditions could be true if this, or could change in this, that would make it possible for you to support it? And just again, there's lots of other tools and skills around this work, but I agree with Courtney. That's actually a good sign typically, but then you've got to have tools for moving people through it.
Thanks both. Okay, we have time at least for one more question. Does anyone have experiences with organizations that are trying to transition the backbone role? Someone's working with a backbone org that's trying to get other members of the coalition to take on more of a supportive role. So I understand that to mean kind of getting others to share the work of the backbone beyond who has carried that role in the past.
I would say again, I think the first thing is really defining what the tasks are in the role, which of those tasks you need others to do, and what you expect that time commitment to be, and then going to others to see if they can help out with those pieces, but with really crystal clear expectations of what it means, what it will require, and how they'll work, how you will work together. Clarity is really critical. I haven't seen people transition a piece of it as much as just transition the whole. I've seen that happen where they transition the whole backbone. But again, it's been really defining it and finding a partner that can hold that role. And the big question always comes up again is resources. And if there's no resource, if we're asking people to take on work without resources, that's always a problem. And so finding ways to do that would be helpful.
Yeah, and I'd just say, like, to Paul's point, earlier point of capitalizing on strengths. So Jen and I actually working with a backbone team that doesn't have data capacity, but they've had an organization step in to support that, but haven't had a formal conversation around what that could look like for them to be, you know, a part of that backbone team and offer that particular skill set. And so just thinking through, like, what makes sense to Paul's point, right? Like, are there resources for us to, you know, compensate these folks, or are there resources to bring this in-house, right? If we see that as a need and a gap in the backbone support role. So just really thinking, I think, more holistically about the ecosystem of partners that you're working with, being realistic about the resources you have in every way that resources show up, right? So from staff capacity, time, talent, right? Because it might actually be where we could rethink some roles, right? And this person actually may have a skill set or could build that skill set to support that. But what does that trade-off look like for our team? So no, I know that's not probably the very straightforward answer that you were looking for, but just sort of thinking through, like, what are the needs and what are the different ways we might be able to accommodate for those.
Okay, I think we might have time for a quick speak. There's one question in the chat that I think is interesting. What is the difference between being a backbone to an ongoing collective impact project versus backbone to building a project, a collective impact effort in a community? So basically, how does the backbone role differ in the startup phase versus a mature sort of ongoing collective? Paul, you're nodding. Did you want to jump in?
I was actually looking to Courtney to start that one out.
Or
Well,
go ahead,
well, and I'm thinking about my own organization and my understanding of sort of how we progress. So when we started, we just had the ED, right? And it made sense to be housed within the United Way because they had an interest in the CI model and the cradle to career work. But as the partnership grew and sort of, I think the needs of a backbone from the backbone grew, it made more sense for the backbone organization or team to evolve into one, its own organization, but to also be staffed in a different way. Yeah, so that probably isn't a very coherent answer to that question, but I think a part of it is having, to Jen's point, like, sort of those core folks, like a person who can help facilitate the process is the biggest piece, I think, in the beginning. And then based on what that agenda looks like and what the needs of that partnership are, being able to say, this is what our backbone team needs to look like to be able to support this work. And it might look like, you know, in the early stages, having someone who facilitates data, I think, is critically important, right? You might, so for us, we didn't have a person on our team who focused on policy until a few years in, right? Because there wasn't a big need of the partnership at that moment. The biggest need of the partnership was to, like, get work groups standing up, get people access to student level data, and get people comfortable using that data. And once we crossed that hurdle, we were then able to say, now that folks are using data and we're starting to identify, like, barriers and challenges in the work and people are starting to learn things, we're starting to see commonalities across these 6 or 7 work groups that are calling now for policy work. So that needs to be a core component of the work that we're doing. Communication, right? I think communication should actually be one of those things, if you can, to bring on early on, right? How are we telling the story and supporting partners to tell the story of the work that's happening? And communication is always an afterthought. So shout out to my comms people who are on here, but it seems to always be the afterthought, right? That becomes really hard to pull all these pieces together because now you have 6 years of work that needs to be, like, explained and codified, et cetera. So really thinking about what are the current needs of not just the current needs, right, but what are the current needs of the collaborative, and then where do we potentially see this growing, and how do we plan for that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think the thing is that collective impact backbones, I'm working with one right now that is a 0.5 FTE backbone and one that has a 26-person backbone. And they work on different issues in different size communities with different size networks and numbers of action teams and strategies. And so it's always hard to figure out what we always say, build the form around the function, figure out your strategy, your common agenda, and to figure out the right form, structure, backbone in order to get that work done.
All right, Paul and Courtney, thank you. Rapid fire. The last thing I will point people to a tool called the eco cycle that talks about how work evolves over time. And literature on eco cycle talks about different leadership styles and skills that are that thrive in different developmental stages of work. So a startup leader has a different orientation often and skill set than a leader of something that is in maturity, has a different skill set than something that is in like a refresh, or we call it creative destruction mode. And so not only specific to the backbone, but life cycle and complexity tools like EcoCycle can also speak a little bit toward the different skill sets required at different stages of project's evolution. So with that, we are at time. Thank you for joining. We hope to see you at our next office hours and our action summit coming up in about 6 weeks. And again, we are always here, lots of resources on our website, and thank you for joining today.